Okay, all right, I will call this July 21st, 2022 meeting of the NVTC WMATA Committee meeting to order. We have 4 items on our agenda, 3 substantive. First of all, we have a review of the June 16th, 2022 WMATA committee meeting summary. This will not be a voting meeting, committee meeting, so I just see if anybody has any corrections that could be noted for the record. Changes? Okay, so no changes on the meeting summary for June 16th. Okay, so let's jump into item number 2, the 2022 update on the annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. Yes. Kate first. Oh, Kate, yes, thank you very much. Kate, go ahead.
Well, I'm here for the whole time, so I'm happy to squeeze in. Good evening, gentlemen.
No, that's good.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great. We see Wonderful. You and we hear you.
And so I actually am really happy to report I did go to the Commonwealth Transportation Board meeting yesterday morning. I had the opportunity to testify. There's actually only a total of 3 people signed up for public comment. One was me, one was Noel Dominguez from Fairfax County, and then there was another person related to the New River Valley who was on another issue. So I did have the opportunity to introduce as well as remind the Commonwealth Transportation Board members of who NVTC is, obviously the importance of WMATA, touching on everything from moving people, congestion mitigation, economic development, and really what it means for all of our workforce and moving them around. I specifically highlighted moving people in and out of the Pentagon as well. And then I did go and share the priorities that this committee has identified of areas of concern and interest. And obviously Andrew's going to go over those again to remind you in just a minute. And so I think overall, I believe it was really well received. The first words out of the secretary's mouth after I finished was "hear, hear." And so one thing I forgot to mention in the tone, and I know Chair Alcorn, you saw the remarks, the tone of my remarks was very much, we would like to work with you, Commonwealth, with the Department of Rail and Public Transportation to solve, the challenges that are facing WMATA, because it means so much to all of us. And I think that message was very well received. And so there wasn't a ton of dialogue because it was just public comment. But a little bit later on in the agenda, it was an action meeting. There was the action to put into the VDOT budget, the just under $72 million had been taken from the DRPT budget and put it into VDOT's. They have a fund to handle any overages due to inflation. And at that time, Mary Hines also chimed in and spoke to really the importance and the value of the Commonwealth coming and helping and working with Northern Virginia to keep things successful. So, and I guess sort of finally, at the very end of the meeting, the secretary did speak up again and did say, we cannot let Metro fail. It is too important, and that he really does want to work with us. So I thought it was a really promising message that came out of there. Obviously, time will tell, but I'm really glad that I took the opportunity to go down there, and I really appreciate everybody's support in helping frame that message.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. I just asked, how were Noel's comments received? Were they received as well, or was there any
yeah,
feedback?
I think they were fine. I mean, we actually did do a little bit of coordination, and so I was the one that went first, and so a lot of her was falling on after mine, but then specifically talking to some of the needs and desires of Fairfax County. As you know, Chair Alcorn, but others may not, Fairfax County also actually provided a written letter to the Commonwealth Transportation Board articulating a number of things related to the CTB action. So I think collectively, I think both of our remarks went really well to articulating to the CTB how important it is for us to find a successful path for Metro. And I do want to note there were 4 brand new CTB members that had just been sworn in. So this is, again, another opportunity to have them introduced to Metro and to NVTC.
Very good. And just for the committee's background, one of the things the Fairfax County comments focused on was well, frankly, when local governments in Northern Virginia pay the metro subsidy, it's primarily coming from the real estate tax.
It is.
So anytime you're talking about taking money that's not coming from the money the Commonwealth Transportation Board has at its access, and you're putting it onto local governments, you're putting more burden on the local real estate tax. So that was something as a local government.
60 to 70% of the budget.
Exactly. Exactly. So, any questions from committee members?
Kate, appreciate the update.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. All right, now we will go to, after that interim item on the agenda, let's go to the 2022 annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. So I think we're all familiar with this item. This will be the 5th annual report produced by NVTC. And this update from staff will be our final work session for guidance before they finalize the report for submission later this fall. So Andrew, I believe this one's yours.
Yep.
All right.
Go to next slide. All right, so the structure of the annual report remains the same as what we proposed in June, but I do want to note that the introduction has been modified to reflect feedback from the committee to set the right context for the fiscal 24 operating gap, talk about some of the structural funding issues that we've highlighted, and then highlight the importance of Metro with a focus on the delivery of new services this year, like the Potomac Yard Station and Silver Line 2, pending their completion. Next slide. So this slide shows the 7 strategies proposed for the 2022 report. This reflects the committee's input in the June meeting to add recommendations about non-railroad structure. What we've done since then is reordered these to start with strategies that increase revenues, talk about strategies that control expenses, and then the last strategy, the new financial operating model, is meant to be all-encompassing. What's new this year, and we'll talk about this a little more further, is that the last 2 strategies are highlighted to note that they are for NVTC to sort of take an action or conduct a study, which we'll get into shortly, whereas the first 5 are directed to, sort of recommended to WMATA to take an action on. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these just one by one at a high level. This first strategy is on the subject matter of confidence, and the recommendation covers a lot of territory, but basically encouraging safe return of the 7000 series trains to service, offering frequent and reliable rail service, improving the physical safety and security of customers, and reforming management and safety culture. All of this, of course, is with the goal of rebuilding confidence with riders and also with funding partners. Next slide. This strategy is on the subject of fare evasion, and the recommendation is for WMATA to work with partner jurisdictions to enforce fare payment uniformly across the system to address customer safety and security and improve WMATA's financial condition. Some background here is warranted, as this issue is quite complex and has a history. Right now, we have reliable data for fare evasion on Metro Bus, but not for Metro Rail. On Metro Bus, operators press a key to denote the occurrence of fare evasion, and there are automated passenger counters that provide reliable data. For latest data shows fare evasion on Metro Bus is 42% in DC, 34% in Maryland, and 6% in Virginia. With the installation of new fare gates on rail, data collection is underway, but we don't yet have available data due to calibration issues that we hope will be resolved in a timely manner. Fare evasion laws vary by jurisdiction, with these laws citing fare evasion as a civil or criminal penalty varying across the regions, states, and local governments. DC decriminalized fare evasion in 2019 to a civil fine, but they have not completed an adjudication process. Because of this lack of action, MTBD has not been able to enforce fare evasion in DC, while it is being enforced in Maryland and Virginia. The strategy put forward by staff is to enforce fare payment uniformly across the system to address customer safety and security and improve WMATA's financial condition. Customer safety and security is listed here first intentionally, as there has been an increase in the number of Part 1 and Part 2 crimes in the system. The board has received numerous complaints and testimony about unsafe behaviors and conditions on rail and bus that drive current and potential riders away. Next slide. This strategy is for WMATA to continue instituting a simple and convenient fare structure that drives ridership and revenue. To provide some background here, the board approved revised fare policy principles last fall, and these essentially call for a simple, convenient, seamless, and customer-focused fare structure that drives ridership and revenue. There have been some incremental steps taken to date on fare simplification, including the weekend flat fare after 9:30 on weekdays, and free transfers between bus and rail. The committee did discuss fare policy last summer, and in that discussion, there was an interest in a flat fare zone system. So we've reflected this we've added that to this last sentence in the recommendation. And based on the committee's discussion last month about inflation and the looming budget gap, we've added that WMATA should consider a fare increase in the next budget. Next slide, please. This strategy is for WMATA to continue to increase non-fare revenues, specifically from joint development and advertising. WMATA has a mature joint development program and has recently released a 10-year strategy plan for joint development that seeks to implement 20 new joint development agreements by 2032. Next slide, please. The next strategy here is for WMATA and the funding partners to manage cost escalation and collective bargaining agreements. Strategy recognizes that we're seeing very high wage increases in the current collective bargaining agreements due to inflation. It also includes a prior recommendation to amend the Wolf Act, which is also known as the National Capital Area Interest Arbitration Standards Act of 1995, which would require the arbitrator to consider Metro's financial condition, the ability of jurisdictions to pay in the arbitration process. Next slide. Yep, thank you. So this slide and the next one are a little different. These are recommendations and strategies that are directed at NVTC. So in this recommendation is for NVTC to conduct a study examining the policy, funding, and other implications of Northern Virginia local transit agencies, assuming the operation of Metrobus services in Northern Virginia. Each jurisdiction in Northern Virginia has a different balance of service between their local provider and Metrobus. If we look at Northern Virginia as a whole, through the service additions or takeovers, there's been a gradual increase in the share of local transit provided. With Metrobus as the largest subsidy by mode, further exploring that relationship has the potential to yield subsidy savings at WMATA. However, the idea of local transit agencies assuming the operations of Metrobus services carries with it a host of funding, and that includes federal, state, and local policy, governance, and other implications and considerations that need to be explored. We envisioned that this study would be a policy brief on those pros, cons, considerations, implications, and would lay out the trade-offs for our jurisdictions as they continue to chart their own course on their relationship with Metrobus. After taking feedback from the committee, staff will further put some teeth essentially on what this recommendation and study would look like and engage our jurisdictional staff and committee in the fall with greater detail. Next slide. And this last recommendation here is also directed at NVTC, and it is for NVTC to create a WMATA operating funding working group. This group would develop and recommend how to align expenses to revenues, but with a focus on existing and potentially new revenues. This recommendation was developed by staff and included here in order to respond to feedback from committee prior meetings that we need a new financial operating model at WMATA. We envisioned that this working group would be similar in structure to the 3-person CAP working group from 2 years ago, where NVTC staff convened jurisdictional and DRPT staff at a director level, and we had strategic touch points with the commission and the WMATA committee. Like the previous recommendation, we look forward to discussion on this item, and we'll put forth further content on what this could look like over the summer for additional conversation and consideration in the fall. Slide. And so this slide just lists all 7 in one spot so you can see them. But to help frame the committee's discussion, we intend to basically further each of these over the summer and work on a draft for the committee's review in the fall as we reconvene. So I think at this point I'll pause here. Turn it over to the chair for discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. And I would note for recommendation number 6 or strategy number 6, we will be having at least some initial discussions or related discussions.
Oh, yeah. In the next set.
On the agenda. So I'll wait on questions relating to Metrobus until that one comes up. But other questions, comments from committee members? Good. And that's what we talked about.
I don't even know whether anybody's got the stomach for me to repeat something that we've talked about ad nauseum.
Please.
And let me preface this by saying a couple things. One, I've lived here my whole life. I was present as a teenager, so you can do the math, that on the big vote across Maryland, DC, and Virginia to have a metro rail system, a unified authority. Everybody had to vote yes. It's a big deal. And I am a big booster of transit, especially our metro rail system. Slide 11. Can we go back to slide 11? So now we're talking about, among ourselves here in Virginia only, the NVTC, third bullet. Well, all three of them really, that we all have our own metro rail, our own bus operations. We're fare free now in the city of Fairfax for our little bus system. And we're looking at ways to do more so that the metro bus rail does less. Quote, to a potential path forward, assuming the operation of Metrobus services to reduce WMATA's expenses and their subsidy. We cannot have this conversation unless we go back to your slide on fare evasion and you know, I go to the COG meetings, go to TPB. I think regionally, I think the whole Washington DMV, the whole thing. But I'm elected by a jurisdiction in Northern Virginia. And I think most people in the DC area have no clue about the status of fare evasion in the system. They just don't know any of this. And it would probably be best if they didn't, because if they did, it would not further the broad objective of regional cooperation and unified transit systems. But, you know, I'm not saying that NVT should not do this, but I'm just saying that we've got to, as we move forward and have a discussion about potential local bus operations that would be trying with one goal of relieving the expenses of WMATA. You know, I mean, fare evasion is 42 million total, if I recall.
Not 42. I believe it's 42%.
42%. All right,
Yeah.
42%. And we don't know what it is on rail, but 42% for buses. That's pretty substantial, quite frankly. So
Those expenses are all, or revenues are all shared system-wide for Metrobus. Exactly. Right, to your point.
So I've made the point again. We were all thinking it. I just said what people. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I am not a reactionary. Listen, I am not a reactionary right-wing crazy. I am simply saying that that's our reality.
Thank you, Mr.
All right,
Meyer.
and there's nothing more that we need to discuss on that, unless somebody else wants to. So the short answer to your question, Mr. Chairman, is I'm fine with this. Okay. But trying to be intellectually honest about it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Any other comments?
No, I'm fine as well. I think this well reflects our prior discussion. I think it reads well. In addition to fare and evasion, I'm very concerned about perception of safety or lack thereof, physical safety and crime.
Yep.
And I think the extent to which the region as a region has ignored the crime situation is getting to, well, it is beyond the point where it's acceptable in my view. But I think since this is a committee dealing with Metro, the most that we can say about it is Metro in and around the Metro system. And I think it should be in and around and upping the police presence and doing everything we can. Fundamental, in my view, to not losing the riders we have and really recreating this system the way it was.
So thank you, Mr. Strider. I think that's pretty much captured in item number 1, right? Strategy number 1, rider confidence.
Is one, and we
Is that in
can
there?
answer that as needed.
All right, very good. Any more discussion on? Okay. All right, then let's move on. Next, we have item number 3, Metrobus service and subsidy update. So we have a presentation on this. NVC staff have been monitoring Metrobus service in the region and subsidy trends, and we're going to get a briefing on their findings. So Andrew, back to you.
Right. So for this item, I'd like to give an update on what staff are seeing on service and subsidy trends. In regard to Metrobus, as the chair mentioned, we've been keeping tabs for a while, and I think some of what we'll talk about tonight has been referenced by staff or WMATA board members at prior meetings. But what we've really done is taken a deep dive into the data and tried to lay out what we're seeing so that the committee and the commission can make informed policy decisions about these topics as they come up in the future. So there's really 3 key points that I'll try to keep hammering home throughout the presentation and we'll explain and visualize them later in the slides. But first is that Virginia is unique in the region. Most of the additions to bus service that have happened in Virginia have been done through local transit agencies. This, however, is unique. Our partners across the river mostly add service through Metrobus. The second key point is that historically, the amount of Metrobus service provided across the region has been largely stable. What has changed, though, is the distribution of that service between Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And the pandemic has caused shifts in how service is distributed, and this shift has over time been away from Virginia. The third key point is that the current way Metrobus subsidies are calculated, it's not adequately reflecting how service has changed. And so while service has shifted away from us, the subsidy has stayed the same or gone up. So we're essentially paying more and getting less. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So who provides bus service in the WMATA compact area? Services provided by Metrobus in a mix. In DC, the local service provider is Circulator. In Maryland, it's Ride On in Montgomery County and the bus in Prince George's County. Next slide. So before we talk about how service has changed, I need to define a few terms about how we describe service. I'll use 2 key terms to describe how much bus service is operated: vehicle total hours and vehicle revenue hours. Vehicle total hours are how many hours a bus is operating from the point where it leaves the garage in the morning, runs passenger service, and then returns to the garage at night. Vehicle revenue hours are a smaller portion of that total, which is the time in which a bus is picking up or dropping off customers. For both of these, the higher the number, the more service is being. Next slide. There's several key events that I'd like to lay out that are pivotal in how we think about Metrobus region and how we think about Metrobus subsidy. On the service side in blue, we have some key events to consider that affect the amount in the distribution of bus service. First is that over this time period, there have been local service additions as well as local service takeovers of Metrobus routes. These are gradual over time, depending on the policy choices of our local providers. Next, I would like to point out that fiscal 2018 was a tough budget year for WMATA. We saw many Metrobus routes truncated or discontinued, and most of those have not come back. Things were pretty stable for a few years, and then the pandemic hit. That caused some temporary service reductions. For Metrobus, many, but not all of these routes have been restored. In September 21, WMATA implemented additional route restorations and the Metrobus frequent service network that was a 12 and 20-minute frequent bus network on a number of routes. This service improvement increased frequencies across the region, providing 12 or 20-minute frequencies for most of the day on these routes. For example, the 28A along Leesburg Pike saw frequency improvements to every 12 minutes between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m., 7 days a week. And last, on the service side, we're looking towards the future, which is somewhat mixed. We know we have an operating budget gap coming soon as the federal pandemic aid is exhausted. We also have the bus network redesign study kicking off later this year, which is expected to last a few years. Many of the Metrobus routes operating in the region have been in the same route for decades, sometimes half a century or more. The study aims to develop a new Metrobus service plan strategy, create a more efficient network, and respond to shifts in land use, customer demand, and other travel trends. On the subsidy side, in green, there's much less to say. Basically, the last major update to the Metrobus formula, that's the way subsidy is split up, was in 1998. The next big change to how we pay for bus was in the fiscal 20 budget, when the WMATA board adopted a new way of calculating the subsidy in order to respond to the legislative 3% caps enacted by Virginia and Maryland. In this new method, Virginia, Maryland, and DC all get a flat 3% increase in their subsidy with no regard to how service is changing. The last major point here is that the bus network redesign study calls for updating how we pay for bus, recognizing that a lot has changed and that a lot could change as a result of that study. Lastly, I do want to mention that between 2016 and today, bus recovery rates for bus have been declining. And this is a factor driving increases in Metrobus subsidy over time. That does tie back to the fare evasion points that Mr. Meyer mentioned in our last agenda item. Next slide. Slide shows the distribution of bus service, and that's Metrobus, the total of our local transit agencies in Virginia, DC, and Maryland, from fiscal 09 to fiscal 19. As you can see, Metrobus service has historically been mostly stable, which is one of the key points, with around the same level of service provided across the region. You do see minor drops in service with the Great Recession in fiscal 10, and then fiscal 18 was that bad budget year that I mentioned earlier. Local transit in Maryland and DC is mostly stable across this time period, but local service in Virginia is the real story here. It steadily climbs throughout the decade. This is through a combination of local service additions and Metrobus takeovers, which takes us back to key point number 1. Virginia is unique in the region and how we add local service. Next slide. The next few slides, I'm going to look at Metrobus service over time, focusing on fiscal 16 to 23, and looking at how much Metrobus service is being provided in Virginia. As you can see, the trends are similar to what I discussed before, mostly stable with a temporary decline from the pandemic, and then a big shift when the new bus network, a new frequent bus network was implemented. In these slides, that network shows up under fiscal 23. The most important thing to look at here is that the trend over time towards fiscal 23, as you can see on the right, DC declined a little, Maryland actually gained a lot of Metrobus service, and Virginia declined by 12%. The next slide. So basically what happened is Metrobus service was temporarily reduced due to the pandemic, and when it was restored, it came back in a different way. This brings us back to our second key point. The implementation of the 12 and 20-minute frequency network significantly redistributed service towards Maryland and away from Virginia. So I do want to pause a little bit and explain why this shift in service happened. What it comes down to is that pre-pandemic bus customers and post-pandemic bus customers are very, very different. Many bus routes in Virginia were 9 to 5 or commute-oriented. And the ridership of these services has not recovered, while more transit-dependent routes have shown increases in ridership. Making decisions about changes in Metrobus service during the pandemic, WMATA looked at the following criteria. Right, number 1, ridership demand, which is where were riders now, not where were they pre-pandemic. 2, equity and essential travel, looking at today's low-income minority ridership where essential travel could be supported. And 3, redundancy. With limited resources, multiple bus routes can be consolidated on the same corridor and or shifted to Metro Rail, where riders can now take advantage of the free bus to rail transfer that was implemented last fall. As the American Rescue Plan funding and pandemic recovery look on the horizon, WMATA moved Metrobus service towards recovery, and that 12 and 20-minute frequent Metrobus network fit into the concept of an all-day service plan to provide consistently high levels of service and respond to new post-pandemic travel patterns like less peak service and more off-peak service, and less peak travel and higher off-peak travel. The frequent service plan also benefited low-income and minority riders and took advantage of that free bus to rail transfer. Next slide. The next 2 slides cover the same time span, but are showing the Metrobus subsidy for Maryland, DC, and Virginia rather than the level of service. The biggest finding of this slide is that the subsidy everyone paid for Metrobus has gone up over time. This makes sense. Fairbucks recovery rates have decreased. The pandemic also took hold during this time period. With a closer look, shows that the percent increase for DC, Maryland, and Virginia here is relatively uneven. Even though Virginia lost service, its subsidy has still gone up substantially. Next slide. So I mentioned previously that the 3% operating tax changed the way it's calculated. This is a factor in the disconnect. Service has grown and become more pronounced as service has changed significantly post-pandemic. This brings us to that third key point, which is that the way Metrobus subsidies are calculated do not adequately reflect how service has changed. And in effect, Virginia is getting less than service. Next slide. All right, so we've looked at the distribution of local bus and Metrobus service in the region, and then looked at subsidy and service for Metrobus and how these trends have changed. Which brings us back to those 3 key points. Virginia is unique in the region. We're the ones who are really adding that local bus service. 2, historically, Metrobus service across the region has been stable, but the distribution has shifted because of the pandemic. And 3, the way Metrobus subsidies are calculated are not reflecting how service has changed. So as for next steps, NVTC staff will continue to work with jurisdictional staff, this committee, and WMATA board members to explore and understand these trends further. We'll also incorporate our findings into current or future studies like the regional bus analysis at NVTC and the potential role of Metrobus study that we discussed last agenda item for the annual report. And lastly, we'll engage with the bus network redesign study that will kick off later this year. And that study calls for a new service plan for Metrobus, but also updating the way that Metrobus is paid for. So, done.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. Excellent presentation. A lot of really good data in there. I do have a couple of questions. So you talked about how pre-pandemic and post-pandemic we're seeing ridership changes. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What kind of, can you categorize those in any way? What are those changes looking like?
I think broadly speaking, Alan can jump in with some of this research.
Sure.
I think broadly speaking, less peak hour, less commute oriented trips in a traditional sense, and a little bit more weekend and off-peak travel in general.
Okay.
I think obviously there's a lot of unknowns about the future. Return to office continues, but so there's a lot of uncertainty. But if you want to add.
So yeah, so go ahead.
I think you did hit the nail on the head. Those are the 2 big things. Telework fundamentally changed, which changed that 9 to 5. We saw the impact on Metro Rail, VRE, and some of the commuter patterns. But the folks that stayed around on Metro were folks that were transit dependent, people that were reliant on it, which saw the demand change when they needed it. And they need all day, more predictable service. That's where we're starting to see a slow evolution over to it, like Andrew said, on the weekend as well. So we're still digesting where that's going to end up, but there has been a big pattern because Metro Rail service is still very low relative to pre-pandemic. Same thing with VRE. It's not unique to the DC region by any means. It's something we're seeing across the entire country in the transit industry. But these fundamental parts about the bus, those ones change really rapidly. And the thing about bus is it's easier to adapt your service on bus than it is to rail. So that's why you're seeing people changing a little more rapidly on that side. It's going to take a little bit longer to figure out how rail fits into that.
Okay, that's helpful. So you talked about how basically why people or when people are going, less on the rush hour and the commute. What about the non-rush hour and weekend? Where are people going? I mean, are we seeing that being reflected in the numbers as well? Are those, I mean, what is that looking like?
I think we're still seeing people using it to commute, but now with flexible schedules, telework, you don't get that really hard up and down of afternoon peak and morning peak. You get more of like, I'm going to come in for half a day. So there's sometimes a lot more demand midday. So you've seen that move all around. And because of the pandemic and a lot of the financial implications of how people were impacted, those that were impacted the hardest financially, they're now using transit more. And those you're seeing more like, well, they're going to the doctor, going to access, services, hospital, groceries, things like that. So you're seeing that people it's not that they weren't using it before the pandemic, but it's just a little bit more visible now. But that we did see a little bit of a shift more to the weekend because the number of people using transit on the weekend has jumped up significantly. It's relatively higher amount compared to what it was weekday. So there has been a shift over into the weekend demand as well.
Okay, very interesting.
I think anecdotally, I've noticed on rail that I think the evening has a sharper peak. So, but obviously with the 7000 series being sort of sidelined for the moment, I think there's still a lot of late demand for rail. It isn't being supplied. So
Okay, and looking again, a ridership question. Looking at number of riders that are doing local buses versus metro bus in Northern Virginia. What do those numbers look like?
I think if we go this isn't ridership. We have a figure for mileage. So amount of service.
Okay.
Slide 28.
Appendix, yeah. Oh, well. Showed up in the wrong spot.
Oh, it's in our packet.
It's in the packet.
Yeah.
Slide 28.
Slide 28.
So this is not ridership. This is the amount of service provided in terms of miles. And you can see that mileage is a bit more way heavier in the suburbs just because of the metric, but at least in Virginia, 62% of service is locally provided, 38% is Metrobus. I think the ridership, we can certainly look into that. I don't have anything in front of me, but I think it weights a little more towards Metrobus just given the service profile. Happy to.
What I think would also be helpful would be to, maybe a version of that slide on slide 28 that would show what are the mileage percentages intra Northern Virginia versus how many miles go into, say, the district.
Right. So we do have, I did prep that for, let's see, where is it? I think it's hour. It's total vehicle hours.
Okay.
And that's only 3%. So there's 6 routes right now. 6 Metrobus routes cross from Virginia into Maryland or DC. It's the 38B, the NH2, the 16Y, the 16E, 5A, which will plan to be discontinued.
Right.
And then the 3F or Y, depending on which budget year we're talking about. But all of those routes together are about 2 to 3% of total hours from Metrobus across the region. And that estimate's probably a little on the high side the way we had to put the data together. So it's.
So let me just add,
Yeah.
like with the 5A as an example, you took the total time and put that in the category of.
Correct. Yes, so it's the whole thing.
So you're not just counting like how many hours are in, say, the district, right?
That is correct.
So it's the whole route.
The whole route cluster everywhere.
Right. Even with that,
Right.
it's only 3%.
of all Metrobus across the entire region. Yep.
All right. All right. Thank you.
And that's probably a little high. Right.
Okay. Other questions, comments?
I have a question, have you put numbers on any of this, to what extent model what we ought to be paying versus what we are paying? We'll need that number at some point.
Right. We have a lot of ideas in our head, and we'd be happy to consider that a next step.
Got it. But it would be, I think, important to know that. And the assumptions underlying. One other question I have, because Falls Church doesn't have its own local bus system, it once did, but over my objection, it was eliminated. So we're relying on Metro Bus. So I don't know how that figures into all of this. But,
It's an excellent question. I think at this point, we are trying to look at it at just the Virginia scale. When I think we look at service and subsidy, especially on the subsidy side, how it's obviously with 6 payees, each individual city or county cares a lot about how that's calculated for them. So that's not a scale that we've necessarily gotten to yet, but I think we've given a little bit of thought to I think some of the complications and considerations that are needed in that kind of exercise.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, yeah, one thing I would, as you're looking at finances, I'd also, this may even be tougher because the assumptions involved, but if you could look also at capital costs associated with that, particularly the conversion to zero emission fleets. I know that's a big deal for everybody. Maybe that's a wash, one way or the other.
Sure. I think
Maybe that's a list of items for consideration that
is this also linking back to the study that we talked about for the annual report. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I know the intent is for. I know WMATA's intent is to apply for significant discretionary funds for zero emission bus. But I think to your point, for our locals, depending on how they play in the federal space, that's an important policy consideration as well. Yeah, got it. Okay.
No, I think this is a really important piece of work, and I definitely encourage continuing, this exploration and the different action items suggested. I mean, one of the things that, we still have a road system, we still certainly have a rail system, and a lot of our bus system too is still based on a single node system, the hub and spoke system. We're still focused on that, and the reality is we're becoming a region of many nodes. It's almost, there's a really bad word I'm going to use, multinodal. That
Multinodal.
yeah, I know.
Well, no, it's actually. You're right.
So I know.
Read that from.
I know my I get real.
That actually.
But I think it's important to step back and, with the understanding that we are moving in that direction.
That's right.
What does that mean for our long-term bus strategy, and other transportation strategies? So, and one piece that I think would be helpful too, and I don't know if this data exists, is in Northern Virginia, what is the average trip time for a bus rider? Trip length. Yeah, or maybe it's a 25 percentile, 50%, 75 percentile, but our folks at 15 minutes, 30 minutes. I mean, at what percentiles? I think that would be really helpful because, again, moving from the old view that everybody piles in no matter where they are and, goes to the core, it's just not happening like that.
I go from Fairfax or Vienna to Tyson's as frequently as I go to DC.
Yeah.
Or Arlington.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this jumped out at me. I was subbing at NVTA a few months ago, and this was during the pandemic. So, looked at the total number of trips going to different destinations. Total number of trips going into work trips going into DC, 8%. Pre-pandemic, it was 14%. So, that's telling me,
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
it's different. So,
Another thing worth some consideration is more on-demand transit service if in fact we are again to a much more sort of scattered demand across days, across times. And with expectations of the public these days, the concept of microtransit is kind of out there, but where has it really been put in place and how would you do it?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question. We've had one of our interns here this summer. He's not here tonight, but has been diving very, very deeply into that. I'm preparing some work on that, looking at where has microtransit been rolled out in the greater DC area, where has it happened around the country. We've done a lot of interviews, folks, lessons learned, what will they do again, what will they not do again, what did they learn? So we're putting together a report on that. So we'll have that probably a little bit later this summer into the fall, looking at what that is. And one of them, actually what the case study that we looked at actually was Falls Church as a potential example of where you could potentially roll out microtransit. That was kind of our case study model. So I think we'll have some really good information that will come from that. So something to stay tuned for in the not too distant future.
It's interesting. Most of our jurisdictions are Fairfax, Arlington, or Loudoun, large. But when you look at the town of Vienna, the town of Herndon, city of Fairfax, city of Falls Church, they could be a kind of a lab for an experimental approach. I know that 40 years ago, the town of Vienna had it was a short-lived, maybe 18 months. They had a jitney bus program. And it was a small, I don't know how many, if I recall, maybe 15 to 18 passenger. And they had routes that would go through the different parts of the town, but it was flag them down.
Mm-hmm.
There were not necessarily stops that would just say, but it didn't go to every street, but it goes to the major streets within the residential neighborhoods. I think it was probably a concept ahead of its time. Didn't last, but and they were Mercedes, if I recall. So I think that the Mercedes was the only manufacturer on the globe at that point. But I don't know. I really don't know how that actually came to pass, but they did have it for a short period of time. I don't know.
is it Charlie Robinson? Is that his days?
Yeah, I think Charlie was mayor. Yeah. Or maybe it was even
Before
Roger
that.
Seaman. Yeah, actually, might have been Roger.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember.
Very interesting. Well, any other questions, comments on this? Anything you need from us?
I think we got the direction we need. This has been an effort that was a long time coming. So
Just, like a lot of the data requests here, we're keeping track of all these between Andrew and Sophie and Xavier, who you saw at the last commission meeting, and then Andrew and Renetta diving into this data. I know if we let them loose on it, they'll have a lot of different things we can come up with, because your questions are posing some really interesting things, I think, kind of help frame the bigger picture that we
and I think as the bus network redesign kicks off in the fall, we'll be very, very prepared to have that conversation about new formulas, subsidy, all of that. I think this will be the most organized.
Very good. All right. Okay, well, that was our last substantive item on the agenda. Any other business for the committee?
Silver line.
Good question.
When, where, how, how much?
Yeah,
Greg?
Greg?
Anything?
We have a drum roll.
There's nothing, I think, to share that you haven't already heard. We're actually going to be out, Dulles Regional Chamber on Monday. An update on communications, but the website is out. A lot of outreach happening. Go to the website, you can get all kinds of info on what's going on. I think something like 200 plus events have been scheduled for outreach, doing Loud and Fair, all kinds of Fairfax events. So that's all happening. And as I think the interim GM said that he's looking for late fall is what he said. The goal. Obviously, a lot of things to work through between declared as ORD back in June. So working through all those things, had to get the safety commission involved. That's a big one. So everyone's working really hard.
I think some of us were around in July of 2014 when they had the kickoff. They had the big ceremony. Is there some sort of event planned for opening?
Yeah, for sure. We've been speaking with Fairfax County staff, Loudon staff, and MWA in particular, as the key stakeholders there. We'll bring others to the fold a little bit closer. But yes, we're in the sort of early stages of planning an event. There's going to be an event, going to be similar to last time. It'll be a big event, we hope, and working through that. So the planning has begun.
Right. Good. All right. Any other questions, issues, items for the committee? All right, then we are adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you. Oh, do we have something else?
Oh, just simply the last piece is next WMATA.
Yes, please. So the next WMATA committee meetings are scheduled for September 29th, 2022 and October 20th, 2022, both at 6 p.m. So.
And we'll Rhonda will follow up in an email, so everybody's got it.
Very good. Okay, if there's no other business, we're adjourned before 7 o'clock. So.
Take care, everybody.